Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the theology of Paul, the Apostle. We have concluded Galatians, Thessalonians, and Ephesians. We have concluded the Paul debate by N.T. Wright. Now we're going to take on the 1,700-page Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright, the larger project, the larger Paul project by N.T. Wright. And we're going to just take it in small bits. It's going to take us a while. We're going to just go in small portions at a time. In fact, this lesson we're only going to look at pages, Volume 1, pages 75 to 109. We're going to look at 75 to 109. But, as we found out with the Paul debate, it's a tremendously powerful book, this new one. And I think you're going to agree that this first lesson is extremely important in launching this study in the larger volume. So if you don't get it the first time through, listen to it again. And if not, again, get the first lesson down because it is extremely important with regard to Paul's theology. Let's begin with the triad on the left. We're to begin with the faithfulness of Israel's God is the starting point for Paul's idealized world. This theme interpenetrated Paul's three worlds of the Jewish, the Greek, and the Roman. It was the theme of the deliverance for Israel. Paul was a Jew conditioned by the narrative of promise that he had memorized in his rabbinic education under Gamaliel. All non-Jews were considered ethne, or other nations, and that included a negation of these individuals. There was always an assumed negation of all Gentiles, but all Gentiles were considered ethne. But Paul very much was a Jew conditioned by promise, the promise of the deliverance for Israel and the returning doxa glory of God. On block 2, the ideal of promised faithfulness was next conditioned by Paul's concrete historical existence as a Pharisee. So he had his ideal of the anticipated future glory of God returning to the temple, but he had his concrete identity firmly established in the sect of the Pharisees. Pharisee was a term Paul used to describe his former self. Foundational for the Pharisee was the zeal for the Torah. And in Paul's day, there was a slowly emerging transition from politics to piety. There was an overriding concern for personal piety. In opposition to this, there was in opposition to the movement toward piety, there was the revolutionary wing of the Pharisees that were also on the rise to prominence with a zealot-type identity. So you had this move toward teaching and piety, and you had the zealot movement as kind of a both moving parallel to each other within the Pharisee sect. Now the zealot movement culminated in the revolution of AD 66 to 70, which resulted in the temple being destroyed, and 500 Jews per day were crucified by the Romans to teach the Jewish zealots a lesson. 500 Jews were crucified each day. 500 crosses and corpses were put up every day after they put down the revolt. The Romans taught them a lesson. The movement toward piety centered its identity in the Shema prayer, which was, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, out of Deuteronomy. And that meant that Israel's God is the true king of the world. There was an active concern to maintain balance between God's sovereignty and human responsibility. But now we need to go to block 3. We need to take a look at the Pauline split. This is going to help us to really make some sense of some things. The Pharisee sect had split into two divisions. There was the Hillel and there was the Shammai. The Hillel were the more relaxed and non-militant division of Pharisees. Hillel's grandson was Gamaliel, who later led the division and advised the Sanhedrin, and Paul studied under Gamaliel. So Paul initially was studying within the more relaxed Hillel division of the Pharisees. Now the Shammai, they were extremely strict on purity. They had established guidelines for maintaining Jewish loyalty, and they approved of sacred violence. They were zealots. They did approve of sacred violence. In Acts 5:39, it's Gamaliel, the Hillel Pharisee, who advises leaving the Christians alone. And also, if they opposed something that was God's will, then they would be theomakeo, they would be fighting against God. So Gamaliel did not approve of persecuting Christians. Now, note 3, the conflicting image in Paul that we have is that in Acts 22:3, we find that Paul studied at the feet of Gamaliel as a non-zealot. However, in Galatians 1:14, Paul says that he was a zelotes Pharisee. He says, I was a zealot of the Shammai division that would approve of sacred violence against Christians. So, Paul, I tried to make sense of this for years, but because I knew Paul was a Pharisee, but how could he murder Stephen? I didn't understand that. How could Paul murder Stephen? It made no sense to me. Now, after this teaching from N.T. Wright, this makes perfect sense. He did study under Gamaliel, but he moved over to the Shammai Pharisees that approved of sacred violence, and he therefore could become fully aligned with the truth of the Pharisee sect and still participate in the stoning of Stephen. So as our final triad, our little mini inserted triad, we've got Paul as a Shammai Pharisee. God's faithfulness and the shame of prayer was the beginning. Paul's identity centered on the faithfulness of Israel's God. And then block 2 is Zelotes. However, Paul moved from the Hillel division of the Pharisees to the Shammai Zealots. And that resulted in block 3, sacred violence. Prior to Paul's conversion, Paul endorsed violent opposition to Christians. He, as a Shammai Pharisee, he approved of and believed in violent opposition to Christians. You could persecute Christians with sacred violence. I think this is an important teaching because I never could make sense out of how could Paul be a part of the execution of Stephen. But now, this makes sense that he moved from the Hillel to the Shammai Pharisees. He moved from one division to the other. We need to look at another identity factor for Paul, because he was also a Diaspora Jew, one of the Jews of the exile. He lived in that exilic time of the Jews in their elongated exile and dispersion. So let's move to the triad on the right and take a look at Paul as a Diaspora Jew, one of the exiled Jews. And it's going to be in page 89 to 109. A diaspora identity. Paul lived and was raised in Tarsus of Cilicia. He was one of the dispersed diaspora Jews. There was a wide range of practice and belief throughout the diaspora. And basically, there were 3 aspects of the diaspora Judaic belief. They became assimilated into other cultures. They became acculturated through other languages. And they became accommodated unto foreign religious practices. And they were dispersed throughout Egypt, Asia, Greece, and Italy. Paul's worldview, therefore, passed through many stages of story, symbol, practical questions, and praxis. And note 5, Paul's symbols, or his signs, as a diaspora Jew, included the mezuzah scroll. It was a small scroll attached to one's doorpost, and it contained two passages from the Torah, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, the Lord God is one Lord, and Deuteronomy 11:13-21, bind God's word that resides in your heart, bind it upon your hands as a sign. Both of those passages were on a mini scroll that was fastened to the doorpost of a Jewish believer, especially a Pharisee. The second signification for Paul would be the Torah, from which the Judaic believer would gain patterns of behavior. Next was the Sabbath, which had acquired a wide sign-like status in Paul's day. The Sabbath actually had acquired kind of a sign-type status. And then he also lived under the belief that the Jews were designated the people of God, a single people over against the multiplicity of the worlds, and they took up the moral facets of the Torah to mark themselves out as God's people. And they also Paul took up the covenant of the ancestors. That means the ancestral codes and practices, including food laws and restrictions for fellowship. So Paul had a diaspora identity. Just because he wasn't in Jerusalem, even in Tarsus, he had a very strong Jewish identity because many of the ancestral codes were practiced throughout all of the dispersed regions. Let's move on to block 2. We're going to look at the ethnic identity. Paul was a member of the Yahad community, which is based on two interlocking factors. There was kinship, and there were the traditions. Additionally, there was the land of Israel, which belonged to the one true God. It was focused on the temple in Jerusalem, which was the focus of Jewish life. All synagogues, the synagogue in Tarsus, and throughout all of the diaspora, always pointed to the temple in Jerusalem. The synagogue was a meeting place between heaven and earth. And so the synagogue in Tarsus actually was built to point toward the temple in Jerusalem. Paul was also a part of the great controlling narrative for Israel of the Passover, the Exodus, the freedom, Sinai law, the covenant, and the homecoming in glory. It was a narrative of how God dwells with Israel, the true people of God, and it was a narrative of how God skenao, or tabernacled with his people, how he dwelt and tabernacled with his people. That's the Greek skenao. So Paul had a very strong Jewish identity that was a diaspora identity and an ethnic identity, and he had an identity in anticipating the return of the Doxa Glory to the Jerusalem temple. Let's move on to block 3, because he did have that Jewish hope also. In block 3, this identity in God's abiding Doxa Glory was represented by the prayer life of Israel, and through prayer, the Jew received blessing and deliverance. The name Yahweh abides with the people of God. Yahweh and Doxa almost became interchangeable during Paul's day, and above all else, the temple was a place of praise. Through Paul, Israel's narratives of promise, Israel's story of promise, developed fresh resonances, fresh interpretations. That Paul would take these Israel narratives and reinterpret them through the filter of his encounter with Jesus Christ. Now, this next note on Paul's 3-element temple theology is the key to the entire lesson, okay? Well, I'd say it's equally important with, first of all, knowing that he was a Shammai Pharisee, but Paul, before he ever became the first Christian theologian, Paul, before he ever became the first writer of Christian doctrine, he was a Jew who already held a 3-element temple theology. It's extremely important. This is his starting point. His starting point was a three-element temple theology. It began with the fact that the temple was a microcosm of creation. There was a creation iconography that filled the temple. There was a lampstand of the 7 planets, the table of the circle of the zodiac year. And there was the altar of the incense spices of the entire world. And the high priest robe was a robe that symbolized the celestial world. Therefore, filling the temple with doxa glory meant filling all of creation with doxa glory, with God's glory. Second, the temple was the house of David. Kinship and temple were closely tied together. Herod the Great built a second temple to help legitimize his kingship. Third, it was the place of the exilic prophecy of the return of the doxa glory of God. The Jews expected the return of the doxa glory to the temple. It will bring about new creation, new Genesis. It will come in a great convulsion. The return of glory will come about through a convulsive shaking of all nations. And with that, you might want to remember that when Christ was crucified, there was a shaking of the earth when the curtain was torn. The veil was torn from top to bottom. And in Jewish belief, they believed the return of the doxa glory of God to the temple would involve a great convulsion, a great convulsive shaking. Some Jews interpreted the Torah taught by priests as God's new presence in the temple. But basically, Paul lived, prior to conversion, with a Jewish story in search of an ending. Paul was a Jewish believer, a Pharisee, a Shammai Pharisee, in search of an eschatological ending to the Jewish story, to the Jewish narrative. This is, I think this lesson centers on 2 key factors. N.T. Wright starts us out with, first of all, realizing that Paul made a shift from Hillel, Pharisee division, to Shammai, Pharisee division, and did endorse sacred violence. Second, Paul did possess a theology prior to his conversion, a 3-element temple theology. And I'm going to give that as a summary triad in a little mini podcast. So I'm going to wrap this one up, but I'm going to go on and give an additional little bit of a summary triad. We can look at that basic proto-theological position of Paul as prior to conversion. Because Jews didn't really do theology, they didn't do systematic theology, they did theology through story. The Old Testament is a collection of stories, a collection of narratives. The narrative of Adam, the narrative of Abraham, the narrative of Moses, the narrative of Jonah and Nineveh. It's a collection of narratives. That's how Jews did theology. However, they had one theology that did develop during the elongated exile period of living in Jerusalem under Roman domination and Roman corruption, living with a corrupted temple. They did develop a eschatologically apocalyptic, hopeful anticipation of a truly possessed temple theology. So the Jews had a temple theology. That's the closest they got to a systematic theology. They had a temple theology. So you can kind of say that they had a twofold representation of what they believed. They had the story, the narrative of Israel, and the temple theology, and those both were interrelated to the Torah. So you had narrative and temple theology and the Torah. That's going to wrap up this lesson, and then I'm going to just post a little mini summary triad on temple theology.